Hey everybody, this is Arnie from Scotsman Guide. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we are hanging out with Joe Tyrrell, president of ICE Mortgage Technology, formerly Ellie Mae. Joe, have you got any big socially distanced holiday plans this year?
Just trying to keep everybody in the family healthy, Arnie, so that we don't have to spend this Christmas apart.
Speaking of Christmas, we are wrapping up 2020 here, and as we move into 2021, we wanted to chat about some things we're seeing and how they'll shape the next year. And with Ellie Mae maintaining its millennial mortgage tracker for quite a while now, we wanted to check in with Joe and see how our origination community can keep up with our biggest block of home buyers. Joe, it seems like our biggest 2020 shift has been demand moving out of our urban cores a little bit. How much of our younger buyers been part of that trend?
Yeah, what's interesting about the millennials, and you mentioned the millennial tracker. So we've been doing this for a number of years now, and it really does give lenders some really interesting insights into each of the specific census tracts and how you're thinking about marketing to millennials. In many respects, millennials have kind of been ahead of the curve in entering home ownership outside of the urban or kind of traditionally close to metropolitan areas. And this has largely been driven based upon just the lack of entry level inventory in those areas. So they've kind of been forced to have to look more in the suburban areas where there's more affordable housing. I think the pandemic has not only increased that perspective, and certainly because of the need for additional space, but there's been one other very interesting pandemic related surprise that I think's really come out in 2020, specifically for millennials and their need for more space and moving out from urban areas. And that's the need for outdoor space for pets. That's increased exponentially. You can't really read any articles about pet adoption right now and see that 2020 has been just a historic year across all age bands, but especially among the millennials. I mean, if you think about it, people are not jumping on planes to travel, and the feelings of isolation caused by the pandemic, millennials are adopting pets well before family formations, which is normally when you would see them turning to adopting pets. Well, now that they're adopting those pets at much greater rates, they want to make sure that they have room for those pets as well. And so having a little bit of a side yard or a backyard, especially with the rate of dogs that have been adopted this past year, we see that as another interesting trend that kind of established itself in 2020 and further drove those millennials out of those urban areas.
That's interesting. Now, Joe, if we expect this to continue, is this exodus large enough or sustainable enough that we can start to consider, well, what happens to the housing that these people migrating away from cities are leaving behind?
And when we look at the key urban areas, obviously we immediately focus on the coasts, right? So if you look at what's been happening in California and New York, certainly Florida, I think, is a little bit of an outlier from how they've been handling the pandemic. Most of the coasts, they get fairly locked down. And so you've seen, I know certainly being out here in California, it feels like every week I'm learning about a neighbor or a friend of mine who's relocating out of the state. And some of that might have to do with taxes, but a lot of it is largely driven by the fact that they actually can live somewhere else without necessarily having to leave the company that they work for. Even in other areas like Chicago, big city, where you're starting to see a lot of those people moving, further and further away from the city because they're just not contemplating returning to a commute. So certainly you've seen, or we've seen that there is, while there's been continued price appreciation across the country, and some of those more populated, more dense urban areas where there's a bit of an exodus happening, they're certainly not appreciating to the same level. We had a conversation with someone that I work with here at ICE Mortgage Technology just the other day about them looking hard at the San Francisco market, waiting to see when it starts to soften because of the number of people moving out of the city and moving to more rural suburban areas, and they're looking to come in, but not so much from a relocation into the city, more of looking at it as an investment opportunity for rental on property, because that's what they think will happen is likely when people do return to the urban areas, they'll return as renters to make sure that it's going to be something that they feel is right for their families before making the decision to actually purchase and relocate back to the dense urban areas that are throughout the country.
Right on, Joe. Now, let's switch gears a little bit. What do you see as the biggest adaptation that our mortgage industry needs to be nimble about as we enter 2020?
Yeah, so as we enter into 2021, I think there's two things, the two types of change that we think lenders are going to be really grappling with. The first one is certainly the pandemic accelerated certain areas of focus for automation, e-close being one of those. If I look into 2021 and the biggest expectations, I think e-closing is going to really start to begin the shift towards becoming the new standard. And it's going to take a while to get there, but I think you'll see that shift happen in earnest, simply because people want that as much of a touchless experience as they can. We've seen people doing drive-throughs, handing tablets through the window, using pointers to indicate to the borrowers where they need to sign. Certainly, as more and more states are able to roll out and support um, RON signings, that will further enable e-close. But there's been a rush to hybrid e-closing in certain areas with certain products in 2020, but they still have a lot of bifurcated operations for these lenders. I think you start to see that really shift to just e-closing becoming the standard in 2021. The other thing that I think you'll see in 2021 is as volumes start to normalize, lenders are going to have to embrace automation that enables them to scale without having to rely upon hiring. We know firsthand, because we've spoken to so many of our customers, it was tough for lenders. They know they could have done more volume, but they just lacked the capacity based upon the number of people that they had. And there's a lot of technology that can be adopted to help with this. And so I think as volume comes to more normalized areas, this was a big learning experience for the whole industry, but specifically lenders, where they're going to be looking at how they scale without having to rely so heavily on people. But the other big thing for 2021 is just going to be change itself, right? As you look at as administrations change, regardless of what side of the aisle your political beliefs are, anytime there's a new administration that comes in, the focus really isn't on regulation or deregulation. For lenders at this point, either of them represents the same thing, which is just change. Change that has to be adapted to, change that has to be adopted. And so that change, and we've dealt with QM, ATR, TRID, TRID 2.0, ERLA, and there's likely more change on the horizon. It just means that those lenders have to have their businesses disrupted to adapt and adopt. In 2021, with whatever changes a new administration brings, um, it's going to be critical that our lenders are able to stay focused on the business that they have available to them while ensuring adherence to whatever this next change is. And that's going to determine who comes out of 2021 with a competitive advantage. So it's going to be the adoption of that automation, because in certain ways you can't turn back from what we've started with e-closing, and in others it's going to be handling the next change that none of us know is coming yet.